Are you banking everything on evolution?
No, and I don't know of anybody who is.
Do you find that many of your life assumptions and decisions are built on the foundation of evolution as scientific fact?
No, the idea of evolution actually doesn't affect my life very much. What decisions would I base on the idea of evolution?
Well, I suggest that you prepare yourself because that foundation is about to be demolished.
Okay, so let's say that it is, and you disprove evolution. So what? Does that make me a theist?
Not long ago, I was challenged by a PhD evolutionist I know to read a book called The God Delusion by a famous atheist named Richard Dawkins. I took the challenge and I was not surprised to find that it was a very dark and angry book.
What? No, not really. It isn't exactly in all caps and exclamation marks.
They say that atheists have two things they want to communicate with people. Number one, there is no God. Number two, I hate him.
No, not really. Most atheists are just ordinary people and don't say much about the matter. But some people who are atheistic do believe that the idea of a god is a bit ludicrous, but you can't conflate the two ideas.
This describes Dawkins very well.
Maybe, I guess you could say, but his book was much more informative than that.
It was actually more a philosophy book rather than a science book.
Well, he actually talked a lot about science. I mean, it wasn't entirely about science, but it wasn't exactly supposed to be.
He spent a great deal of space in the book not dealing with science, but rather tearing down every weak religion in the world and then lumping Christianity in with them.
No, that's not what he does. In fact, in the second chapter, page 37 in my hardcover copy, he says this, and I quote, "Unless otherwise stated, I shall have Christianity mostly in mind, but only because it is the version with which I happen to be most familiar. For my purposes, the differences matter less than the similarities. I shall not be concerned at all with other religions such as Buddhism or Confucianism. Indeed, there is something to be said for treating these not as religions, but as ethical systems or philosophies of life." So did you even read the second chapter?
He proceeded to criticize the Bible, but it became painfully clear that he knows little about the Bible.
No, actually. Coming from somebody who spent a great deal of time studying the Bible, he has it pretty spot on. Now, I myself have only gotten to the fourth chapter because, quite frankly, there are other books I'd rather read. But looking at the seventh chapter, which is where he deals with the Bible, what he does is state what's in the Bible, then cite the verses that he found the information in, and then he talks about the information, all fairly accurately. So, did you read the seventh chapter?
He gave great emphasis to judging God, yet he does not believe in God.
And I don't believe in Darth Vader, but I can still condemn his actions.
Nor does he believe in any foundation for absolute morality with which to pass moral judgment on the God he doesn't believe in.
Says who? I doubt he said that himself. But if you really need an objective standard for morality, you can use this. Anything that is harmful or intended to be harmful towards another is immoral, at least insomuch as it is more than necessary and against the will of the victim. So there you have it, objective morality, no God required.
I was stunned that the substance of the book was so empty and vacant.
But that's either because you didn't actually read it, or because you read it with such a heavy bias that you mentally didn't get past the dust cover.
Now, if you look closely at the top of this book cover, you'll see that Richard Dawkins is referred to as the most formidable intellect in public discourse. Wow! Who am I to disagree with such a man?
Nobody's saying that you can't disagree with him. You have as much right to disagree with him as I do to disagree with you. The fact that a book cover says that he's really good at his job doesn't really mean much of anything.
No, I'm not here to say that I'm smarter than Richard Dawkins. I'm here to tell you that I am right. And truth trumps genius.
Sure, I guess, if that makes sense. But genius is pretty good at finding the truth. I think what you mean to say is that evidence trumps the popular opinion, which I can agree with.
Even Richard Dawkins acknowledges that living systems have the appearance of design.
So, that only says something about our perception, not about what reality actually is. Our beliefs shouldn't necessarily be reliant upon our perception, but instead on reliable evidence.
Yet all you have to do is look at Dawkins and myself to realize that there are two radically different ways of looking at all this apparent design.
Yes, one of them is based on observable empirical evidence and logic and reasoning, while the other is based on religious superstition in a really old book.
Either everything came about by accident, or it came into being on purpose.
No. You're one of those guys who like to use the word accident, don't you? The universe or life didn't appear by accident, because accident is something that happens against the intentions of another. But there was no intention behind the formation of the universe, or of planets, or of stars, or of life. It would be more accurate to say perchance, but even that would be wrong, because it formed out of natural processes.
Either it all happened by natural law combined with random chance,
You mean natural processes under the necessary circumstances.
or it was carefully directed by an intelligent mind. Either these complex mechanisms are merely an illusion of design,
So you do get it. Sorta.
or they really are designed. Honest people can disagree on this. So how am I going to demolish evolution right now?
Ooh, let me guess. You're going to use flawed arguments that have been long played out. You're going to use complete misunderstandings of science and add uneducated assertions on top of them. You're going to argue against popular media, such as magazines and television shows, instead of anything that's truly scientific in nature. Bonus points if you use cherry-picked quotes and data, or argumentum ad lapidem. Let's see what you got.
Remember that I said that atheists like Richard Dawkins freely admit that living systems look designed. In fact, they will marvel over this illusion.
Some of them. And again, that says more about our perception of reality than reality itself. Believe it or not, our perceptions aren't reliable information.
So it becomes evident to me that God has already made his case, just as it says in Romans 1.
Forgive me if I don't think that the idea of things looking really cool is valid evidence for the existence of God.
But keep in mind that for the atheist, evolution is the only game in town. There is no rational basis for atheism without it.
Believe it or not, the rational basis for atheism isn't based on evolution. If evolution was proven false, that doesn't mean that we need to believe that God exists. We still need valid evidence for the existence of God.
So demolishing evolution is the crucial first step to opening his eyes to the marvel of God.
Actually, the first and pretty much only step would be actual proof in God.
Do you remember the story of the emperor's new clothes?
Yes, I do. It isn't exactly relevant here, but I got a chuckle out of it the first time I heard it.
Now, if you're going to be like the little boy at the parade, you need to be willing to question the experts. The first question to ask, and one to be asked all along the way, is this: do they really know, or is it speculation?
And the answer is we know with almost complete certainty. Those of us who follow scientific ideas base our beliefs upon observable reality.
Science is from a root word meaning knowledge. The search for this knowledge begins with the scientist making a guess or speculation about a potential truth.
Actually, the first step is to observe phenomena. The second step is to form a hypothesis that attempts to explain the phenomena. Then the experiment tests the hypothesis, and you know the rest.
Keep in mind that only a small portion of these speculations turn out to be verified later on by direct observation or repeatable experiments.
Says who? Where did you get this idea? Do you know, or is it just speculation?
An expert is someone who's a better guesser than the next guy.
No! An expert is somebody who spent a great deal of his life studying something in a particular area. They tend to be well-educated people.
But even the top experts make many more speculations than the facts they confirm.
Again, I have no idea where he got this information, but science isn't based on hypotheses. It's based on evidence.
Sometimes scientists dishonestly pretend that their speculations are science, and then arrogantly expect us to accept them without verification.
No. Scientists tend to know what they're doing. If anything, that would be the media's portrayal of scientific ideas.
This is actually a real problem that is rampant in scientific circles and becomes very deceptive.
The biggest problem in scientific circles are groups that are paid to produce a particular outcome, like those hired by pharmaceutical companies.
In your own mind, it's essential that you sort out the real science from the speculations.
And I agree, media's portrayal of science is pretty wrong, and it's pretty difficult to truly understand what it's talking about. But the problem isn't with scientists, it's with the media.
Here's a great example of what I'm talking about from the cover of National Geographic in July of 2010.
Oh look, we can cross this off our list.
The sensational headline says, 4-million-year-old woman, and you see what appears to be a very old skull. Well, first of all, you should know that this is not a skull at all, but is a plastic computer simulation from a very few bone fragments.
That's because it's a magazine and not archaeological documentation.
And even the speculated skull looks more like an ape than a woman to me.
That's what it appears to be to you. You're saying that this isn't what experts say it is because you don't think so? And even if it does look like an ape, our early ancestors were a lot like apes.
Secondly, they have no idea how old those few bone fragments actually are because there is no radiometric method in science that can date fossils at 4 million years.
What about potassium-argon dating and argon-argon dating? Those kind of work.
Carbon-14 dating goes back thousands, not millions of years, and other radiometric techniques only can be applied to igneous rocks, not fossils.
If a bone is buried in the ground around it tends to be as old as the bones.
The 4 million year date is based entirely on the assumptions of evolution and nothing more.
No, it's based on actual evidence.
So, after a second look, this magazine cover looks much more like speculation than fact.
But that's mostly because you don't believe in it.
It's an even greater problem with reporters who write articles. Beware of articles where you read the words, scientists say, or experts say.
And I agree. Articles should cite their sources, at least in some way. And these vague wordings don't exactly help. But I'd be especially wary of articles that say, one study shows. But what would be even better is if you didn't use newspapers and magazines as a source of reliable information.
Or 140 million years ago.
Hold up, you can't just lump that in with genuinely vague words. Chances are there's some sort of basis for them saying that.
Some years ago, when my daughter was in a biology course, I thumbed through her biology textbook, and I was stunned to read these words. In fact, birds' feathers evolved from reptilian scales.
And that's ludicrous. Feathers are related to hair. But I'd like to point out the fact that you don't actually cite the specific textbook, which makes me believe that you don't have it with you, which in turn makes me believe that the last time you saw it was this some years ago. Now, human memory is very fallible, more so than you think it is. But even so, chances are you just misunderstood what it was saying. So there are a number of reasons why we can take this quote with a grain of salt. Also, we can scratch this off our list.
Folks, do you know that with hundreds of thousands of fossils found, not one fossil has ever been found between a scale and a feather? There are zero facts to substantiate this speculation, and it is anything but science.
Again, that's something we both agree on.
Yet we find such giant leaps of faith in science literature all the time.
And that's something that we disagree on. I mean, if that's true, why did you have to cite such a vague source?
Words mean things.
So we got a word biologist here.
The first word to clarify is the word evolution itself. I heard one evolutionist tell me that the meaning of evolution is simply change. Folks, this is not a helpful definition.
And I agree. All it needs is a little bit of clarification. Evolution is the idea that organisms can change over time.
One difficulty we need to overcome is that there are different kinds of evolution.
No, there's not. There are different degrees of evolution, but there's only one type of evolution.
One of the most important kinds of evolution is known as abiogenesis.
No, it's not. Creationists, listen up. Abiogenesis is not evolution. Those are two separate ideas.
It has to do with how the first living thing came to be. This kind of evolution assumes that random chance and natural processes somehow brought the first life into existence from non-life, rather than by intentional design of an intelligent mind.
No, it's not assuming that. It's saying that. Now, we don't really have any indication as to how it happened, but we have indication that it happened. I can tell already that that's what your argument is going to revolve around.
The popular idea is that billions of years ago there was a primordial goo that happened to come together at just the right temperature with lightning and all the right chemicals and speculated gases to form amino acids.
Actually, that's not the popular idea. Nobody can really say that it happened that way.
Amino acids would be important because they make up proteins which make up living tissue. Back in 1953, the famous Miller-Urey experiment was done in an attempt to prove that simple amino acids could form by themselves, naturally.
Yes, the experiment was to show whether or not complex organic compounds could form under the conditions that were thought at the time to be the conditions of the early Earth. And it succeeded at just that. But since then, our idea of what the Earth's atmosphere was composed of has changed.
It was boasted that the experiment was a success, but it was a grand failure on many levels. Like any mixture of amino acid molecules left to itself, half of those molecules in the mix had a backwards molecular structure, and these backwards amino acid molecules block the formation of functional proteins like a poison. Even worse, the byproducts of the soup they made were even more toxic.
I tried to look this up, but I couldn't find any information about it, so I don't know if it's true. But even if it was, the conditions could very easily be different and thereby produce amino acids that were more likely to produce life.
So if anything, Miller and Urey proved that if the amino acids found in living things formed by some natural means, this wasn't it.
And that's not really a problem. We have no way of knowing the exact way these things were formed.
Thus, the experiment fell flat.
No, it clearly demonstrated what it set out to demonstrate, and later similar experiments continued to produce favorable results, and varying conditions produced varying compounds.
But here's the dirty little secret about abiogenesis. There is no theory in science for abiogenesis.
That's what I've been trying to tell you. This isn't a secret, this is pretty well known.
There is no serious model explaining how life from non-life could happen. None. Oh yes, there are scientists who have made unsupported guesses about how a particular component, such as the complex RNA molecule, mysteriously built itself. But unsupported guesses are as far as they ever get.
They are not unsupported guesses. They are educated guesses made from the information that we have available, but there's really no way to prove any specific model.
Because they can't even force that first step to occur artificially, let alone naturally.
Actually, that's exactly what they've done. They artificially imitated what may have happened naturally. But like I said, we don't know the exact circumstances.
Complex molecules would have to materialize before biological evolution could ever get started. But what is the mechanism? What is the model? There are impossibilities everywhere that have never been addressed.
What? There are no impossibilities. There are plenty of unknowns, but not impossibilities.
DNA is required to build proteins, but proteins are required to make DNA.
In the way that they work now.
Or what about the ATP synthase molecule made of thousands of atoms perfectly put together as a highly efficient proton-powered rotary engine in one enzyme molecule? ATP synthase is a relatively recent discovery by Boyer and Walker, and this hyper-complex molecule that manufactures energy currency, essential for any kind of life, had to form itself before evolution could even start.
No, that's not the case. Believe it or not, not every organism is dependent upon ATP. The only thing that is necessary for life to start out as we know it is for something to form that can replicate and that can change as it replicates. ATP can evolve from there.
So with all the talk and Star Trek episodes notwithstanding, I've got to ask a question. What theory of abiogenesis? There is none.
And we all know this. The idea isn't exactly how it formed, but that it formed. And there's plenty of evidence to assume that it did.
What? You mean atheists like Dawkins and TV personalities like Chris Matthews and Bill Maher, who ridicule creationists for being superstitious simpletons, are themselves betting the farm on a complete fantasy without any science whatever? Yes, that's exactly what they're doing.
No, it's not a fantasy, and it's certainly not outside of science. It has been demonstrated to be possible, and it's the most reasonable explanation. If it was proven wrong, somehow, that wouldn't mean that a God exists, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's unreasonable to believe.
The primary thing atheists hang their hat on is abiogenesis, and there's no such thing.
No. If anything, the primary thing atheists hang their head on is the lack of evidence of a deity. If you can show us evidence, then we'd believe. But there isn't exactly any evidence that holds up to reasonable criticism.
For the sake of argument, let's assume that we didn't just demolish abiogenesis.
Well, we don't exactly have to assume, but okay.
And so, we need to discuss a second kind of evolution theory, neo-Darwinism.
Again, there aren't different kinds of evolution. Neo-Darwinism is pretty much the idea that evolution works alongside natural selection. It does involve evolution, but it is not a form of evolution.
This kind of evolution theory asks how simple life forms became complex life forms.
Actually, it explains it.
The idea is that life began as one simple cell which started the so-called tree of life, evolving and branching out into the many species we have today. More importantly, Neo-Darwinian evolution is all about genetic information.
No, it's not. It's about how well genetic changes fit in its environment.
As our understanding of the nucleus of the living cell has taken giant leaps over the last 40 years, we now know that in the development of living things, information runs the show, as Dr. Stephen Meyer puts it.
Who is not a scientist. He's just an intelligent design advocate.
The genetic instructions contained in a single human DNA molecule is beyond anything we previously would have imagined. 3 billion pairs of nucleobases in a single molecule. Each nucleobase itself is a small molecule and functions like a letter in a 4-letter alphabet. That's equivalent to a library of approximately 10,000 books, all contained within one human DNA molecule. Somehow we went from 0 to 10,000 books worth of information. The obvious question is, where did all this information come from?
Well, that's easy. Genetic mutations that add nucleotides or even whole chromosomes.
Now you are bound to hear neo-Darwinists using 2 other critical terms, microevolution and macroevolution. These 2 terms are very troubling.
No, they're not very troubling at all. In fact, they're fairly accurate.
At best, they are misleading, and at worst, patently dishonest.
No, they're not. That's exactly what it means.
The reason I consider them to be so insidious is because of the assumptions behind them. Micro means small scale, and macro means large scale. But when evolutionists frame the issue in quantitative terms like this, they are engaging in sleight of hand. If we accept this trickery, and then the evidence for tiny genetic changes are presented, we will also have to accept that bigger changes can eventually accumulate.
So you get it then.
However, we're not talking about different amounts of genetic change, we're talking about different kinds of genetic change.
That's not true at all. Amounts of genetic change are exactly what we're talking about.
The issue is the direction, not the scale.
What are you talking about? The only direction that a genetic change can take is away from the original organism. With each genetic change, it gets further and further away from what it was at first.
Small genetic changes are indeed occurring with virtually every new generation of an organism. This is called breeding.
No, breeding is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is not the same thing as mutations.
But these changes merely remix genetic information that already exists. This should be called horizontal evolution, not microevolution.
No, it shouldn't. We're not talking about hereditary differences, because that isn't a genetic change. What we're talking about is mutations.
Evolutionists are suggesting that by adding together lots of instances of microevolution, we can assume that it ultimately results in macroevolution.
We're not assuming that, we're stating it. That's pretty much the definition of macroevolution.
They expect to get a big glass of orange juice by crushing a lot of little apples.
No, not at all, because those 2 things are not related. And even if they were, existing organisms don't change into other existing organisms. And if they did, it would be more accurate to say that generation after generation of planting cherries, you would eventually get something that may be like a plum. They're 2 totally separate things, but they aren't all that different.
But what they call macroevolution should really be called vertical evolution.
No, they shouldn't, because you're just creating a straw man version of evolution. Oh look, we can cross both of these off our list.
As I said, the amount of the change is not the point, but the direction.
And again, I say the only direction that it's going is away from the original organism.
Vertical evolution must add bits of new ingredients, new information to the genome, not merely remix the old.
No, it does not. It just needs to change information. Remember the cherry to the plum example? Well, there's genes in the DNA that tells the fruit exactly how big to grow. That can change from as small as a cherry to as big as a plum. It could also change the specifics of how the tree grows and the composition of the fruit to change the taste. There could also be pretty much insignificant changes in the way it reproduces so that it eventually couldn't reproduce with the cherry tree anymore. Add all of that together and you get a new species.
Such new genetic information is what evolutionists have never shown us.
Well, for one thing, we never had to, but I think we have. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Or several.
Even the tiniest amounts of vertical evolution have never been observed and confirmed.
Except, in archaeological records, we have quite a few examples of those. But of course nobody has directly observed that within their lifetime, because get this, macroevolution takes more time than one lifetime. It's over lots and lots of generations, so of course you're going to die out before you see its effects.
So here's the point. Horizontal evolution isn't evolution. Vertical evolution isn't science.
You're right, they're both straw men.
Before we examine the evolution model itself, we need to look at a couple of errors that evolutionists often make with word meanings.
I'm skeptical as to whether we're the ones making the errors. Just saying.
Many people seem to equate the idea of natural selection with evolution. Even Richard Dawkins appears to make this mistake.
I'm pretty sure he doesn't. It's fairly well known that they're two separate things.
Natural selection simply means that weaker members of any given population tend to be the ones that die first, leaving the stronger members to be perpetuated into the next generation.
Sorta, but that's a poor way of putting it. Natural selection states that the things that are fit to survive in its environment survive more in its environment, and things that are less fit to survive in the environment survive less within that environment. Couple that with genetic changes of evolution, and you get that changes within organisms that fit the environment better prevail more. It's fairly simple.
Weak things die. A pretty obvious truth, but understand that natural selection is a destructive principle, not a creative principle. It's all about death. Natural selection does not create viable information, but destroys non-viable information.
Again, you're misrepresenting the idea. The idea isn't just that unfit survive less. It's also that the more fit survive more. It goes both ways. So couple that with evolution, and you get organisms that are fit to their environment. That's us.
You might also take note that natural selection requires a reproductive system, since the process is all about what's left to the next generation. So here's a little question for evolutionists. How could the first reproductive system evolve, since natural selection couldn't be operating yet?
I'm having trouble understanding the question. Natural selection isn't like some external force. As soon as the first reproductive system formed in abiogenesis, that's when natural selection started.
Evolutionists tend to equate two other terms, intelligent design and creation.
Okay, fair enough, but when you're arguing against creation, the differences don't usually matter much.
When evolutionists equate the two terms, it puts their bias and their fear on display. Intelligent design is not a religious theory, but they fear that it will lead to the ultimate conclusion that they are accountable to their creator. So in this sense, intelligent design is as big a problem to them as creation is. It's not that these smart people can't see the distinction, it's that they won't see the distinction.
No, in another video I've explained that you can't assume other people's motives behind their behavior, especially not without their input. Bottom line, creationism is a form of intelligent design. So if you can argue against intelligent design, that also argues against creationism. We don't do it out of caring about the nature of your deity, but we're simply doing it because of the nature of the argument.
The last word meaning I want to talk about is crucial to understand. Like natural selection, mutations are an important part of the evolution model. A mutation is an event in which genetic information is scrambled or damaged.
No, it's when it's changed, in just about any way.
A mutation can be caused by radiation or poison or other things that disturb the DNA code.
Mutations don't have to be caused by anything external. They happen naturally all the time.
A mutation is not good, but harmful, because it makes chaos out of order.
What? These ideas of chaos and order aren't what you think they are, and they're not very scientific, at least not the way you're using it. And all genetic mutations do is change genetics. It isn't always bad and it isn't always good, but it can go either way. Or neutral. A genetic mutation can make you less sensitive to temperature, which would be a bad thing because you couldn't sense danger as well, but it could also increase your sensitivity to temperature, which could potentially be a good thing. Just for an example. Organisms may have a complex structure, but they're not perfectly orderly like you think they are.
It is a genetic accident that randomizes a portion of the information.
There's that word accident. It's not an accident, it's merely a phenomenon.
Evolution has become such a part of our culture that many people think mutations are productive things, but this is not true.
And sure, most of the time it isn't. Heterochromia isn't exactly productive, and neither is Down syndrome. but that doesn't mean that it's always unproductive. Genetic changes could very well be helpful.
A mutation is a genetic accident.
Nope.
A portion of the design
Nope.
is ruined.
Nope.
Mutations destroy information.
Nope. Before I go, I want you to take another look at this image. He's showing us a genetic mutation that adds nucleotides to DNA after he was complaining about there's no way that genetic information is added to the genome, all without realizing his contradiction.